Hello everyone and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome to lesson number 6 of module 1. Did you know that the human eye has the equivalent f-stop values are f8.3 in bright environments and f2 in the dark? Now, that might seem like some random numbers and not a very interesting fact, but I guarantee you by the end of this lesson you will find that absolutely fascinating, because in this lesson, of course, we're talking all about apertures. So you are here with myself, William Eames, your course educator. Thank you so much for joining me for lesson number 6. As I always say, the key to success is to keep attending the lessons. I hope you all enjoyed our previous lesson and had a chance to play around with all of the different shutter speeds available to us on our cameras. Did you get a chance to get out there and do some long exposures, maybe do a little bit of panning, or maybe just do some basic experiments using fast and slow shutter speeds? I hope you did, because it just opens up so many more possibilities to you in terms of what you can do with your photography. You now have more creative control, and we're going to add to that now in this lesson by expanding on it and introducing our apertures. Of course, if you have any questions at all, please do remember to ask Morpheus. Just simply type in there to have a chat with him. You can also put your questions to the classroom as well if Morpheus is not giving you the responses that you need or that you want. And you can also always reach out to us at any stage as well at support@shawacademy.com. So, as I mentioned at the start of the lesson, we are all about apertures in this lesson, and this is another big part of our photography. Shutter speeds were the first part of our exposure triangle, and now we're going to speak about apertures, the second part of our exposure triangle, and what new creative choices we have when we introduce controlling apertures to our photography. So we had a look at this in the last lesson. We were speaking about our exposure triangle, and we were having a look at shutter speeds in relation to time. Now we're going to be talking about light, which is why I have it highlighted here, and that's because aperture is the main control that we have over the amount of light that is allowed to expose the camera's sensor. So we saw shutter speeds control the duration, the amount of time that light reaches our camera's sensor, but now we control the actual volume of light, the amount of light that reaches the camera's sensor through the control of our apertures. And we had a look at the eye at the start of the lesson, and if we think about how our eyes work, we know that when we're in dark environments, if we're indoors or we're at night time or anything like that, our eyes, they open up, the pupils dilate. They dilate to allow more light to enter in. So here we've got a close-up of an eye. You can see here the studio light there, very, very clearly there as well. But you can see how wide the iris is here. And that is to let lots and lots of light in. And this is what helps us to see in the dark. As we know then, as well, our eyeballs will constrict, they'll become smaller to reduce the amount of light coming in, to stop the flow of light coming in, so that we can see in brighter environments. And again, you can see here, very, very bright light here. This is a beauty dish in this case being used, things we'll talk about much later on. But we can see the difference here. We can see the dilated pupil here to let lots of light in, more light in, compared to this kind of constricted pupil here. You can see the muscles in the eyes there as well. Really fascinating photograph to restrict the flow of light coming in. And our apertures work in the exact same way. You know, this basic kind of concept here is how our apertures work too. It's an opening that will allow light to pass through, either a lot of light or a small amount of light. Think about it like a tap, or a faucet if you're in the States, where you've got lots of water coming out, or you might turn the faucet to reduce the flow of water coming out. Our eyes and our apertures work in the exact same way. So let's have a look at the apertures in our lenses. So here we've got a front view of our lens. And here we can see that the aperture is open wide. So this is a word that you're going to hear a lot throughout this lesson, and indeed throughout the rest of the course when we're referring to apertures. So when we talk about using a wide aperture, what we mean is that we're allowing a lot of light to enter through the lens. Okay, so the lens aperture here is wide, that means it's open, and this allows more light to flow through. We can close down the aperture, or we can make the aperture smaller, and this restricts the amount of light coming through the lens, just the exact same way as our eyes will adjust depending on the light. We adjust the aperture depending on the amount of light available. And as you can see here, just with this GIF, we can see the aperture opening and closing. So it starts very wide and it gets smaller. And you can see it gets very, very small indeed to restrict the amount of light coming through the lens. Now, with our modern lenses, this is very difficult to see. So, you know, if you're watching this back or you happen to be playing with your lenses right now trying to see the aperture change, it might be quite difficult to actually see it, because a lot of modern lenses, it's just the way they've kind of automated it. It's actually really difficult to see what's going on inside them. But if you're using an older manual lens, you will definitely see the aperture change as you're adjusting it from wide to much smaller. Now, our aperture blades are also a very interesting construction, and they also do come in a couple of different varieties. So here we can see, you know, we've got this kind of hexagonal type of aperture blades. So you can see how these aperture blades kind of fit over each other and will expand out to allow more light in as we open up that aperture. But they do come in slightly different shapes. We've got this hexagonal type of shape here, but it is also possible to get circular types of apertures as well. It's just purely down to the lens's construction. But a really, really fascinating design. You can see how they all kind of fit over each other here. Very, very interesting type of construction. And really, you know, if you ever get a chance, have a look online at how lenses are made, because it's really fascinating what goes in them, and it'll probably give you a new appreciation to as why some of them are really, really expensive. But what's important to understand, just like with our shutter speeds, there's quite a lot of terminology that goes along when we speak about apertures. So, first of all, apertures are expressed as f numbers or f stops. So you probably come across this before and wondered what it is, and we'll explain exactly where the F comes from in just a moment. But if you've ever heard a photographer talk about or ask somebody else, what F number did you use for that photograph, or what F stop did you use for that shot, they're referring to the aperture. They were asking you what aperture value did you use, or did that particular person use for that photograph. Each lens is going to have a certain range of standard aperture sizes, but not all lenses have the same range of apertures. So what I mean by that is there's some apertures that you're going to find in every single lens, and in general every lens is going to go up to about f22. Some older lenses will go even higher than that. Some older lenses will actually only go up to f16, but most modern lenses will go to about f22. But the widest aperture is going to vary from lens to lens, and so not all lenses are created equally. Your aperture range is displayed on the front of your lens like this, and we had a look at this back in lesson number 3. We're going to have a look at it again in just a moment, so don't worry if you have forgotten this. But you're going to be able to identify the widest aperture available to you on your lens. It'll show it usually on the front as this kind of ratio, for 1 to 2.8 or 1 to 3.5 to 5.6 and so on, depending on your own lens. Now, where apertures can get a little bit confusing, and why I think they're a little bit more confusing compared to shutter speeds, is that the lower the f-stop or the f number, the wider the aperture is, meaning more light comes in through the lens. So sometimes photography goes a little bit against logic. So obviously there's a lot of numbers involved in photography, and I think that can be what's very confusing about photography for beginners. And then those numbers tend to go a little bit against what we would normally expect numbers to mean. So, you know, typically a higher number means more, but when it comes to apertures, it's actually the opposite. A lower number means more. So a lower f-stop, the more light that's going to come in through the lens. Now, don't worry if you don't quite understand that yet. We're going to have a look at loads of different examples there to really kind of hammer this point home. But the lower the f-stop or the f-number, the wider the aperture is, meaning more light comes in through the lens. Now, as I mentioned, back in lesson number 3, we had a look at our lenses. We were breaking down all the different numbers that are on them. And one of the things we spoke about were our apertures, and we saw this ratio on the front of the lenses. Your lens will display the widest aperture available to you. It'll always show the widest aperture available to you rather than the smallest aperture available to you, because most apertures, as I mentioned, most lenses even, will go up to about f22. Now, lenses that have a very wide aperture value available to them, these are known as fast lenses. Just the most important thing to take away from this is just to identify, to find where this is located on your own lens. It is really important to understand what the widest aperture available to you is. It's just really important in general to understand your equipment, to know what it's capable of, what its limitations are as well. On zoom lenses, it can get a little bit more complex because some of our zoom lenses have what's called a variable aperture range. Again, if you think back to lesson 3, we had a look at this as well. But this means that the aperture may change when we zoom in or when we zoom out. So at the widest, or at 18 millimeters, our widest aperture available to us is f3.5. But when we zoom in, it's going to close down automatically and it will change to f5.6. And the reason for this is simply due to the nature of the lens construction. To be perfectly blunt, it's actually just cheaper to produce lenses where the aperture closes down when you zoom in. To buy a zoom lens that has a wide aperture value available the entire way through, no matter what focal length you're using, is very, very expensive. So, for example, if you think about, say, a 24 to 70 millimeter Canon f2.8 lens, that's going to cost well over €1,000, but that means you can use f2.8 no matter what focal length you are using. Now, that all probably seems very, very complicated, and it is a little bit complicated in truth at this level, but it is just important to be aware that when you zoom in, depending on your the nature of your lens construction, you may not be able to open up your aperture as wide as you want to because it's simply not available to you. Now, I get asked a lot of questions on this course, but perhaps one of the most frequent questions I get asked all the time is, what does the F stand for when we talk about f-stops, when we talk about f-numbers? And well, basically, in short, the F in f-stop stands for focal, as in the focal length of the lens. So it's a focal stop, but really it's actually more to do with a mathematical equation. So an f-stop is calculated by the focal length of the lens divided by the iris opening of the aperture. So probably the most basic example of this I can give is that if you have a 50mm lens and you've got an f2 aperture, you divide that 2 into 50mm and it gives you 25mm. That 25mm is the actual opening size of the aperture. Now you know where the F comes from, and it's really cool to understand that, but what's more important to understand is what effect our apertures actually have on our photography. So I'm going to bring up what are called our standard aperture values. So just like with our shutter speeds, we had a look at the standard shutter speeds, or the common shutter speeds. Now again, on your own lenses, you may have more numbers in between each of these numbers, but again, there's a very particular reason that I'm showing these apertures and what I would call our standard aperture values. Now, when we use a low aperture number, or a low f-stop, and we need to start using that term f-stops, as I mentioned, that allows more light, but it also has a secondary effect, and it creates what's called a shallow depth of field. DOF here stands for depth of field, and we're going to be using that term an awful lot going forward in this course as well. So a low or a small f-stop or small f value is going to give us a shallow depth of field, where a high f-number or f-stop is going to give us less light, and as we can see, the aperture themselves is much smaller, and that gives us what's called a deeper depth of field, a deep depth of field. So before we can start using our apertures, we need to identify where they are, first of all, on our cameras, and thankfully they're conveniently located right beside our shutter speeds. So we saw this back in the previous lesson. We can see there are 100th of a second there for our shutter speed, but right beside it is our f5, our aperture. Similarly then, you might find it on the back of your camera, again, like on the Canon here, we've got our shutter speed, but right beside that we have our setting here for our aperture, or f5.6. And you may also find it on the lens as well. So depending on the type of lens that you're using, your aperture values may actually be displayed on the lens too, and you can simply adjust it to whatever aperture value that you would like to use. The majority of cameras though, you're actually going to find it somewhere on the LCD, and it's really only kind of older lens constructions that you're going to find an aperture ring that has the apertures displayed on it. So of course then, just like our shutter speeds as well, we can start taking control of our apertures through the aperture priority mode on the camera. So we're switching away from the S or the TV mode, and we're switching to the A or the AV mode. And again, this is a semi-automatic mode. It may appear as AV, aperture value, on your camera, and you can set the aperture size using this, the lens opening size, but the camera will control the rest of the exposure. So very much just like our shutter priority, it means we can just concentrate on the apertures, and that means we can concentrate on controlling the depth of field in a scene. And it's a great way to see depth of field in action and to learn more about apertures. So again, after this lesson, I want you to set your camera to the aperture priority if it's available to you, and I want you to start cycling through all of the different apertures available on your lens to see the different effect. Now you'll need to do this with something not very far away from you. There's a lot of things that determine depth of field, and distance is one of them. So if you're trying to photograph a landscape and you're cycling through all these different apertures, you're actually not going to see any difference. That's a little bit more complicated. That's definitely something we're going to talk about at a later stage. But if you want to practice out your apertures, you're better off photographing something that's quite close to you. So I would recommend that you set up like a still life, maybe photograph some flowers, perhaps photograph a person, and so on, to see depth of field in action. But if you try to photograph a landscape, you're really not going to get that depth of field type of effect, because distance is going to play a big factor in this. And just remember as well, as we've established, your aperture selections are limited by your lens. So controlling aperture, again, this is going to vary depending on the type of camera that you're using. You've got your standard adjustment dial here that you can see on the front of the camera, or perhaps you've got the adjustment dial on the back. You might control it simply by adjusting the aperture ring if you have one available on your lens. But what's really important for those of you who happen to be using a camera that only has one adjustment dial on it, is that you may need to press this plus and minus button to adjust the aperture. You can actually see it has this little aperture symbol beside it. Now, this plus and minus button doubles as exposure compensation as well, which we'll speak about in a later lesson. But if you happen to be photographing and you're adjusting the dial and it's only changing the shutter speed, you're going to have to press this button in to change and rotate the dial to change the aperture. As always, as I mentioned, refer to your user manual to see how apertures are adjusted in your own camera. This is really, really important to understand. Now, likely if you are photographing in aperture priority, you won't need to press that button. But if you are photographing in fully manual mode and you're struggling to change the aperture, likely you will need to press that button. So now that we understand how to control the aperture, let's have a look at the effect that aperture has on our photographs, the creative effect that it has on our shots. So it controls the volume of light coming into the scene. We can choose whether or not we want to restrict that light or add more light by changing the size of the aperture. But it also has the secondary effect, which we've spoken a lot about, which is depth of field. And this is how we get this lovely shallow kind of depth of field, this kind of out of focus blurry effect in the background. We've also got in the background here what's called bokeh, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with already, but we won't be speaking about in this lesson. But it's a nice effect that can come from our shallow depth of field. But the first thing to understand about any type of depth of field is what's called our plane of focus. And I really love this shot because it's so clear as to what the plane of focus is. And simply, the plane of focus is the distance from the camera at which the sharpest focus is attained. Now, to put that in plain English, basically it's the place that we focus on in the shot. The point that we choose to focus on is going to be the sharpest point in the photograph. And you can see here very, very clearly here that the depth of field extends from this point. So the photographer here has chosen this point of the photograph to focus on. They've just simply focused on this area of the shot. And they've used a very shallow depth of field here, a very wide aperture to attain this effect. And you can see here this plane of focus where everything is nice and sharp, but everything in the foreground and the background is out of focus. Depth of field extends from this point. Your plane of focus is simply the area you choose to focus in a photograph, and your depth of field extends out from this point. Now we'll have a look at plenty of examples of this as we move on through the rest of this lesson. So there's two types of depth of field really that we're looking to achieve when we are using our apertures, and the first is of course our shallow depth of field. And shallow depth of field has a blurred out of focus background and foreground. And depth of field extends from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject. So thinking back to our plane of focus just there, when we choose where we want to focus in a photograph, the depth of field is going to extend from about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject. So here the photographer has chosen to focus here on this daisy, and we can't really see anything in the foreground because of the composition, but we can see that we have this really nice shallow depth of field effect here in the background. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not you're using a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field or what aperture you're using, you're always going to have this ratio of about 1/3 in front of the subject to about 2/3 behind the subject. And of course, then we do have our deep depth of field as well, which is the opposite of our shallow depth of field. And this is when we're trying to achieve sharpness throughout the entire photograph. So this is when we're going to be using high f-stops. So f-stops like f11, f16, maybe even f22 to try and keep everything nice and sharp. And this is when we've got sharpness going right from the foreground all the way to the background as well. Of course, again, depending on where we focus in the photograph. And using this type of deep depth of field, we would often use this in the case of landscapes, architectural photography, wide open spaces, or perhaps even if we're taking photographs of groups of people, we want to try and keep everything nice and sharp. You're going to be using a higher aperture value, a higher f-stop number. Let's have a look at this in more detail to really understand it. So here we've got a photographer and we have a lineup of people, and the photographer in this instance has chosen to photograph to focus on the gentleman here at the front of the photograph, and he's using an aperture value of f2.8. So we now know that f2.8 is a wide aperture, and this will give us a shallow depth of field. So when the photographer focuses on this gentleman here, the plane of focus is on this gentleman, the depth of field extends around this person, but because it's a shallow depth of field, everyone behind this gentleman is out of focus. So in this instance then, we decide that we're going to close down our aperture a little bit more, and we're going to change the aperture value to f4. So when I say close down, I'm talking about making the aperture smaller. So we're making it smaller, we're closing it down. Now in this instance, we can see by changing the aperture to f4, we've extended the depth of field now to include this gentleman here in the red. The photographer is still focusing on this gentleman in the front. He hasn't changed his focus, he's only changed his aperture value, he has only changed the depth of field. So we add another aperture, we go up another f-stop number, we go to f5.6. We've extended that depth of field even more now, so it's about halfway in the scene, and we can see now that this lady is now in focus now as well. But the photographer is still focused on this gentleman in the front. So we're only changing our aperture values to bring these other people into focus. So we keep going, we go up to f8. So I should say we stop down to f8, we make that aperture even smaller, and now we brought this gentleman here, second from last, into focus as well. And I think you get the idea here. Now we add another one and we go to f11, and by photographing at f11, everybody is nice and sharp in the photograph, but we're still focusing on this gentleman in the front. So we can change the range of focus, how many people come into focus, by changing the depth of field. So we're focusing on this person and we extend out that depth of field to bring everybody else into focus. Now say though you wanted to choose this lady here to focus on instead, and you wanted to use a shallow depth of field, just focusing on this lady, what do you think is going to happen? Well, this is when we can really use depth of field to create interesting and dynamic photographs. So by changing focus when we're using our different apertures, say our shallow depth of field or our deep depth of field, we can get different effects. So let's have a look at this line of people again. Different people, but here we can see a slightly different take on this photograph. So here the photographer has focused on this lady here, second in the row, but because they've used a shallow depth of field, everyone in front of this lady and everyone behind this lady is now out of focus. So aperture controls the depth of field in the scene. It does not determine focus. We still choose where we wish to focus from. And remember, it's from this plane of focus that our depth of field extends from. So by focusing on this lady here in the second in the row and using a shallow depth of field, the plane of focus now extends from her, and we can then use that to create this shallow depth of field effect where everyone in front of her and behind her is now out of focus. So focusing can be tricky in itself. So let's have a look at how we can actually focus. So now that we understand depth of field, being able to combine it then with different focusing techniques will help us to get the maximum advantage from this creative tool. So first of all, just on the very, very basics, here we've got a fairly sullen looking cat, and we've got our viewfinder here, and we can see all of the different focus points here in the viewfinder. So these little squares that you can see sometimes in the viewfinder, now again it's going to depend on your camera, these are what's called your focus points. And this is where the camera can take its focus from. Any one of these points is basically a point where the camera can take focus from, but in this particular case then as well, it's kind of centered a little bit more. It'll try to get the focus from the center of the photograph where possible, but if it can't, it'll try to use one of these other points here to take focus from. But to activate focus, we lightly press the exposure button to activate focus. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, but it is important to run through it. So when we take a photograph, you lightly press the shutter button, the exposure button, to begin to focus. You'll hear a beep and you'll see the focus points light up when the camera has found focus. Sometimes you'll also see a red or a green dot that will appear to let you know that focus has been found. If this dot is flashing, or you hear the beeping kind of go beep, 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 that means that the camera is struggling to find focus. It hasn't found something to focus on. But you'll usually have some kind of indication to let you know when the camera has, or the lens has, found focus. Not all cameras or not all lenses have the same amount of focus points. Sorry. To clarify that, the focus points are found within the camera. Okay, the focus points are actually found in the camera. So, but not all cameras will have the same amount of focus points. Many modern cameras, and certainly mirrorless cameras, have an insane amount of focus points. They have hundreds and hundreds of focus points. But some older cameras, I mean, even thinking back to something like the Canon 5D Mark II, they actually have a very small amount of focus points. And this just means that it might be a little bit harder for these cameras to find focus in situations where, say, there's not a lot of light available. However, I'm going to show you a technique that's going to help you to get around that in just a second. And as well, there are also many different focusing modes within our cameras. I'm sure you're aware of them again, but I recommend that you just stick with what's called single shot autofocus. So you'll have some variation of this within your camera, but single shot autofocus is recommended at this stage so as not to overcomplicate things. So we want to ensure that our subject is always going to be in focus, and this is probably a little bit easier done when we're using something like essential composition. Like here, our subject is very, very clear. But what about when we want to kind of change our compositions a little bit? Well, let's have a look at an example. So, first of all, to ensure our subject is in focus, we need to select the correct focusing mode. And as I mentioned, for the moment, we're just going to stick with single shot AF, as it's generally used for, say, portraits. It's good for macro photography and so on. There are different modes for different scenarios, which we'll certainly cover as we continue on throughout the rest of this course. We've selected our single focus mode. Some cameras and some phones will also have touch screens to select focus. These are really easy to use because you can actually just touch where in the photograph that you want the focus to be from. But if not, what you want to do then is you want to point your camera at your subject. So point the center of the lens at your subject. We lightly press the shutter or exposure button to activate the focus. You're going to see those focus points light up, and as I said, you're going to hear like an audible beep, or you're going to see something just flash up in the viewfinder to let you know that focus has been found. We then recompose the photograph without removing our finger. We're still lightly pressing the exposure button. We recompose the photograph, and we then take the photograph as desired. So as long as you keep your exposure button lightly pressed after you have focused, it will lock the focus. So this is very, very important and very, very useful. So if I'm, like in this instance here, I point my camera towards the lady here. I lightly press the shutter button to activate the focus, and as long as I keep my finger lightly pressed on the button, I can recompose the shot as I like, and the focus will not change, and I simply take the photograph when I am ready. This method is what I use all the time. It takes a little bit of practice, but I find that, you know, it becomes second nature. You become very, very fast with it, and it'll always ensure that your main subject in the scene is in focus. So take a little bit of time to practice it. Now, there is also an alternative to this as well, and that's what's called focus point selection. Focus point selection. So each one of these little squares that we have here, these focus points that are available to us, they're a potential area in the scene that we can choose to focus from. So typically, if we lightly press our shutter button, our exposure button in a scene like this, the focus is going to generally pull from the closest object, the closest person to the lens. So here in this particular case, we're using a shallow depth of field, but we lightly press our shutter button, and the focus points have selected this lady here in the front. Okay, because it's just the easiest. It finds focus from the closest object, and once it's found, it says to itself, okay, that's grand, I'm going to choose to focus from there. And that can be very, very frustrating if we're not trying to focus on this lady. So what we can do then is, within our cameras we have what's called focus point selection, and we can simply choose what focus point we want to use, either by, again, using a touch screen, or you might have a little dial or little arrows on the back of your camera that allow you to navigate through each of these focus points. So what we can do then is, instead, we're going to choose this gentleman just in the second row, and by activating our focus point selection, we can choose the focus point that is on him. So we choose the one that's on him, we lightly press our shutter button, and it then focuses on him, and we can take our photograph. So this is an alternative as well. You can simply choose whatever focus point you like to work with, and you can even just set it to the center if you prefer. So either one of those methods you can use. I find focus point selection to be a little bit slow. You know, if you're trying to do something quite quick, I think the other method I was showing is much faster, especially when you get used to using it. But it is just another option available to you if you're getting frustrated with your focusing system. So bringing this all back then to our depth of field, let's go back to our row of people and put this into practice. So again, in this instance, the photographer has chosen to focus on the gentleman here in the front, and we can see that now because we see there's a little red dot there just indicating where the focus is. But by changing focus, but sticking with a wide aperture, with an aperture of f2.8, he can move through all of these different people and just have the depth of field extend around whatever person he chooses to photograph from. That's because of the plane of focus and the depth of field extending from where we choose to focus on in the image. And he can change his focusing either by using the method I showed earlier on, the center kind of point focusing, or by changing using focal point selection. So I hope that's enlightened you in terms of how to use depth of field and also how to focus better as well. Takes a bit more practice than, say, when we're using our shutter speeds, and certainly then our next step is to combine them together, and this is pretty much fully manual mode using our apertures and our shutters together. But do experiment with this, try it out yourself, try and set up something quite simple with plenty of light available as well, that you can practice this. There's quite a lot to practice there using your depth of fields and your focusing techniques. But let's have a look at what's going to come up then in the next lesson. So the next one is a important lesson. It's our penultimate lesson, so we're very close to our fully manual mode, but there's a couple of other things we still need to establish before getting into that mode. And first of all is stops of light. And this is how our cameras measure light. So we've touched on this with our f-stops, but we're going to dig into this a lot more. And this is how basically we measure light in the camera. Okay, we have the light meter, which allows us to read how much light is in the scene. So understanding the light meter will unlock fully manual mode, basically give us the power to make decisions as to whether we want to add more light or if we want to reduce the amount of light in a scene. And we'll also have a look at how to use exposure compensation, which is very useful if we're photographing in our shutter priority, our aperture priority, or our program modes. If we like using these modes, we can still adjust exposure by using exposure compensation. So now there are only 2 lessons left, so let's have a quick look at what to expect in future lessons and look beyond module number 1. Firstly, each module has been designed to advance your photography skills step by step. After completing this module, you're going to have a solid foundation to build on. So module number 2 is all about defining your style in photography and finding what area of photography interests you the most. Just like module number 1, there's 8 lessons altogether. We're going to have a look at a huge variety of different types of styles. And each lesson is very valuable because you'll learn how to master nearly every type of photography, and that'll prepare you for nearly anything that ends up in front of your lens. Moving on from there, module number 3 looks at the more advanced features of our cameras, and we will explore all types of the key element to any photograph, which is of course light. Module 3 is all about mastering light. And you're going to master exposure in this module, and most interestingly take control of light with flashes, with studio lights, and this opens up a completely new area of photography, and also the possibility for you to make money from your photographs. Finally then, moving on to module number 4, we look to add a flourish to our photographs by using post-production. And these 8 lessons cover all of the skills you're going to need to edit your photographs. And whatever way you cut it, editing photographs is essential to the photographer and has been since darkroom days. Finally then, we'll have a look in the very last lesson at how to put a portfolio together so that you can move on and start making a career for yourself in photography. Finally, when the course is complete, it really is only the beginning of your photography journey. Whatever your goals are, you will now be able to enjoy your passion. If you are purely in this for the love of photography, you will now be able to take the kind of photographs that you've always dreamt of. Share your work and be proud of the photographs that you are taking. You're also going to become much more creative. You're going to see far more possibilities in your photography than you ever did before. You get the most out of your investment, the most out of your equipment. You'll also know what kind of equipment to go and buy in the future. And most importantly, you're never going to miss out on those really important moments due to a lack of ability. So whether it's a graduation, a wedding, your child's birthday, any of those really important moments that only happen once in our lives, you're not going to miss them anymore. You're going to have these amazing photographs to look back on in the years to come. Now, if you have more ambition, perhaps you have a greater ambition with your photographs, photography is an opportunity to increase your earning potential. You can supplement your income. There's no need to give up your day job and do this full time, but you can absolutely do part-time work as a photographer. Many photographers do weddings at the weekend, or whatever it is that you like to do yourself, whatever area you want to get into, and you can earn money back on your photography. We all know photography costs a huge amount of money. The amount of money we spend on accessories, on lenses, on upgrading our cameras, but you'll be able to make that investment work for you, and you can invest more back into your equipment. Then your photography will pay for its photography. You can also even sell stock photographs on the side, which is a great way to earn an extra little bit of money. So all of those pictures that you're out there taking day to day, you can actually upload these to stock photography websites and have those in the background earning money for you. You can photograph wedding and events, so a lot of these will happen at the weekends anyway, giving you that extra little bit of time to make that little bit of money. And certainly if you've ever photographed a wedding before, you'll know that you only need to photograph a couple of weddings to actually pay back what you spent on your camera. And something else that you can do that you may not have considered before is you can enter competitions and you can win prizes. And this might seem like something that's out of reach, but it actually isn't. If you enter competitions, enter as many as you can. You'll be surprised at how much that you'll place in them, and that you can potentially earn money and equipment through winning these competitions. And most importantly, you'll begin to build a reputation for yourself. Finally, you might decide that you want this as your career full time. Perhaps that's why you are doing this course. The only way you're going to make this a career for yourself is by completing all of the modules, and indeed the other photography related courses. But then you'll have the skills to go out this and make this your full-time career, to make this your life. You'll be a full-time photographer. You can work in fashion and journalism and do nature photography, do food photography, product photography, commercial photography, whatever area you want to succeed in. Probably going to be a combination of a few different styles of photography. You'll be able to build yourself a portfolio and update it frequently. You might be lucky enough to travel the world doing photography jobs. And this is, again, something that might seem out of reach, but it isn't. If your photographs are good enough, people will pay you to go and travel to take photographs. You'll basically live, work and breathe photography, and who knows, maybe someday you might even teach it as well. And don't just take it from me. Millions of students like you have taken this journey before, and just want to give you some insight into some of the students that have done the courses here with us before and their stories, like Sergey here, who, as he is very honest here, was skeptical about his ability to learn photography online. But a point that he makes that I've heard very, very frequently, which makes me very proud of this course, is that he learned more on this course than his friends who attended real life photography courses. And that's because we're able to pack in so much more information. Why we might lack a little bit on the practical side of things, because it's not hands-on, you get so much more information in these courses. And I speak from experience, from going through the whole academic process myself. I took out all the filler, all of the stuff that I don't feel is relevant to students, to only give you the stuff that's going to help you succeed. Or like Marika here as well, she likes the fact that, you know, these are accredited courses, that you're going to get a diploma that's actually recognized at the end of all of your hard work, and you're going to be able to use that to update your CV, your resume as well. Or like Sue here, you know, who is a keen photographer, just starting out on her photography journey, but is really, really excited about where she is going to go with her photography, and likes the fact that there's quizzes and assessments there to help to top up her knowledge. You know, and it's really, really great, and it makes me very happy to see this kind of feedback coming from students just like you on this course. So ask yourself, what's going to happen if you drop out, if you decide to finish here? Well, the simple answer is nothing will ever change. You put that camera down and all of this will be for nothing. And I have seen this happen more times than I could ever count. I've been teaching this course for many years now, and the amount of students that come back to me with regrets that they didn't get past module 1, that they didn't even finish module 1, and they have to start all over again. So my advice is just to keep going. All you have to do is keep going and you will see success. Think about how after every lesson you've taken so far, you have at least one new skill that you can apply to your photography. So imagine after the full 32 lessons how many more things you are going to know. But time is running out. This is limited. We can only enroll so many students on these packages, so get your place and your discount secured now. I know a lot of students have been emailing in, talking to their guidance managers, and are messaging in now saying that they want to do it. So that's great. Let's just keep going and achieve your goals. So most students will take out a 6 to 12 month membership to give themselves the time to achieve their goals. And remember, there's 50% off this for a very limited time. So 50% off, it means you're going to get 12 months education for the price of 6, or 6 months education for the price of 3, and so on. So remember, our mission is to provide you with convenient, flexible, affordable, interactive and internationally recognized education, higher education at a lower cost for you that you can learn in your own way. Upgrading couldn't be easier. All you have to do is log into your members area on shawacademy.com. You'll see the pop-up there, and you can simply choose the plan that best suits you. It's a one click and that's it. You've got your place, you're upgraded, and you're ready to go on to complete your photography journey. Now, so thank you for allowing me to bring all of that information to you. Don't forget our lesson challenge for this one. I'd like you to post 2 photographs, one with a shallow depth of field and one with a deep depth of field. So similar to our shutter speed, I want you to use your apertures now, and I want you to use one with a shallow depth of field and another photograph with a deep depth of field. And please post that to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Shaw Academy. Now, so well done on completing week number 3 on the professional diploma in photography. Well done. You have now completed most of this module. We've just got 2 lessons left on this module, lesson number 7, and then our goal for this one, fully manual mode, on lesson number 8. So until then, thank you so much for joining me for this class, and I'll talk to you all again very, very soon. Take care of yourselves, and bye bye.